welcome back to the channel. I'm still quite behind when it comes to my Marvel Legends reviews, and I've got quite a backlog to catch up on. But today I'm going to look at quite a special 2-pack release, and this is the Guardians of the Galaxy, Drax the Destroyer and Marvel's Moondragon set. And you may be asking yourself, what is so special about this 2-pack? Well, for me, it represents something I've been after for a very, very long time, and that is a classic Drax the Destroyer, or I should say really, the Drax that I grew up with, because it's not the original Drax, but his resurrection in the 90s. I happen to really love this figure. It's been on my wish list for a very, very long time, so I'm really glad to finally have it in my collection. It's also special though, because this also marks the debut of Moondragon. Again, this is a character who's been around the Marvel Universe for a very, very long time, has always been a bit of a subsidiary, a bit of a bit player on the side, but has been involved in some very important events, especially those cosmic events across the years. So it's very cool to have this brand new character introduced to the collection as well. So let's start off by taking a look at the plastic-free packaging. By now we're quite familiar with these two sets. We've had an awful lot of them this year, but it is quite a bulky set. It's a little bit thicker than we've seen in previous releases, although the standard size and shape is roughly the same. It is that oblong, of course. We have the two figures up front and centre. These are digital renderings of these figures, and behind them we have a little bit of a collage. It's faded out in that sort of grayscale or blue scale, I suppose, of the characters taken from the source material. We have, interestingly enough, the Guardians of the Galaxy logo, which is peculiar because I don't really associate these characters as being Guardians of the Galaxy characters. Yes, they're cosmic characters, but I tend to think of these much more in line with the Silver Surfer or the Fantastic Four, maybe the Avengers. I wouldn't immediately think of Guardians of the Galaxy, but nevertheless, that's what they've opted for, and I have to say, overall, in terms of presentation, this looks pretty attractive. It's quite fun. You can put this on display. It's not quite as nice as seeing the actual figures through a plastic window, but what are you going to do? If we look at the side panel, on one side we can see artwork that's been lifted directly from the comic books. This looks very attractive. I happen to really love this approach. I love the illustrated image and I think these look great on the shelf. But if you prefer to see the action figures, you can flip this to the other side, and here you can see, again, digital renderings of these action figures themselves. So this is entirely up to your preference how you like to display them, but if you do stack them on the shelf, you have a choice. And the other thing that's worth noting here is that I did mention that this packaging is ever so slightly thicker. You can see this on the side panels when compared to a more standard set, and that is of course because Drax is so large. And then finally, if we flip the packaging over, we can see the reverse, and this is really nicely done. Again, we have fresh digital rendering images of the figures themselves. It also gives an indication of what accessories they come with, and behind them we have slightly more colour here, more of a collage effect. We've seen this in some of the Avengers sets, but we have different images from across the years, all taken directly from source, from the comic book pages themselves, and I have to say the back looks a lot more impressive than the front to me. Let's kick off by taking a look at the Moondragon figure. As I said, this marks the debut of this character. Now, in terms of costume, I think this is an elegant choice, but it's probably not the one I would have chosen. The one I grew up with was this bright green one with the huge flowing cape, and this tends to be how I think of or visualise the character whenever I hear her name. But that being said, the costume they've opted for is still pretty colourful and quite consistent with the overall silhouette or design of the character. And although I'm not as familiar with this more modern interpretation of the costume, from what I can tell, this looks to be pretty much spot on in terms of how they've brought it to life in plastic form. And in terms of sculpting, I think they've done a really nice job with the head sculpt. This looks pretty accurate to me. I really like that there's a slightly raised arch eyebrow there, giving the character a little bit more expression, a bit more attitude, which I think works really well. There's a slightly austere, slightly menacing look about the eyes. I think that works really well for this character. Something slightly mysterious and unknowable, I think, works very well here. Obviously they've sculpted in the earrings as well, and I think they've done a good job of this. The overall paint apps, obviously there's not an awful lot going on because there's no hair here to shade in or anything, but we do see some nice paint apps around the lips and around the eyes, and I think this works pretty well, even though it's fairly bare bones. The only thing that's really new about this body sculpt is the top of the torso there, where we can see that the sort of triangle in the top of the chest area has been sculpted in. This works pretty well. This feels unique to this character. The rest of it we've seen used on many other female characters recently from the Marvel Legends line. They've simply just painted in the details. Nothing else is sculpted in. So whilst there's nothing terrible about this, it does tend to leave the impression that it does feel a little bit flat, a little bit two-dimensional, and it's so much nicer when things are actually sculpted and then painted painted over because it just gives you a bit more depth. The other issue, of course, and this is by no means exclusive to Moondragon, it seems to be prevalent across Marvel Legends lines these days. There are no washes running through this sculpt anywhere at all, and a simple paint wash can really elevate the depth and the texture of a figure, again, making it feel a bit more three-dimensional, making it feel a little bit more realistic. There's no shading here at all, and that really does hurt the figure overall. My other major bugbear with this figure is the cape. I think it's sculpted very nicely, it's got a really nice design, I love that high collar and the crescent moon on the front of it, but the cape itself is a very hard plastic. Again, there's no washes running through it, and it's not particularly flexible. In fact, it's not flexible at all. You can't pose this at all, and you're kind of stuck with this very awkward, very cheap feeling plastic cape. So, looking at the articulation, there is, of course, a ball joint at the top of the neck, allowing the head to move from side to side, lean left and right, and nod up and down. And there's a pretty decent range of motion here, I can't really fault this. There's ball joints in the shoulders, so the arms will lift all the way up and out. There is a pin swivel at the elbow, so sadly no double joint here. The lower forearm will spin all the way around, and of course it will hinge to about 90 degrees as well, although you do have to be careful because it is on that sort of rubbery pin joint that they sometimes employ. Now there's another pin joint at the wrist, so of course that handle will rotate all the way around, and that will also hinge forwards and backwards. There's a ball joint in the upper torso, so of course the figure will move from side to side freely enough, and she'll also lean left and right quite liberally. There's actually a lot of movement here, which is fantastic. She can also bend forwards and backwards, although this is going to be restricted quite a lot by that cape, so it's something to persevere with. There's more ball joints in the hips, of course, the hips will hinge out to the side, there's an upper thigh swivel as well, the legs will kick forwards, they'll kick backwards, and there's a double joint at the knee so that lower leg can lift all the way back up there, again making allowances for that cape. And then finally there is an ankle pivot allowing the foot to hinge forwards and backwards, but also arch from side to side. In terms of accessories, I'm afraid she's rather light. All she comes with is an additional pair of open hands. Now, there's not an awful lot I would associate with this character necessarily needing to come with, but in this day and age, we're used to seeing some sort of accessories, and maybe some of those mystical effects, maybe some kind of blast effect coming from her head or from the wrists or something like that would have been quite cool. So it's really a shame that we don't have anything else. So then, overall for me, this is a 3-star figure. Now, I'm really glad to have Moondragon in the collection, and for the most part, this is a pretty nice figure, but it is a little bit bare bones. With the exception of a handful of pieces, most of this figure is recycled from many other figures that have come before. And that necessarily isn't a bad thing in terms of the overall proportions, it all works, but I think if you're going to go down that route, then you have to be extra playful and extra creative with the paint apps and the shading that you're going to employ to kind of disguise the fact that you're just recycling parts. And they haven't done that here, so all the detail is pretty much painted in. And whilst it works, it's functional, it does the job in terms of the overall look and aesthetic, it would be so much more enhanced if it had been sculpted in, or if they'd just taken a little bit more time to just actually enhance the sculpt that we have with some decent washes, a bit of shading here and there, just to give it a bit more depth and texture and make it just a bit more powerful. Now, my ultimate preference, of course, is that they would have sculpted brand new pieces for most of this figure and sculpted in that detail, but the other major issue I have, of course, is the cape, and whilst it's nicely sculpted and I really like that high collar, the actual cape itself just feels very cheap. Again, there's no paint apps on this whatsoever, there's no shading applied, so it feels like a lump of inflexible, hard, cheap plastic, and it just doesn't work. I think if they utilised a rubber or even cloth here, this would have helped tremendously. And then finally, the real lack of accessories just indicates a lack of imagination, and it's a little bit disappointing. So moving on to, for what is for me, the star of this 2-pack, and that is Drax the Destroyer. And the first thing you're going to notice about this figure is just how massive he is. And that's just as well, because as I mentioned at the top of the video, this is based on his resurrected appearance in the 90s, when he was drawn by Ron Lim in the Silver Surfer comics, or at least that's how I became familiar with this character. And I love that artwork, and I love this interpretation of the character. He's big, he's massive, he's chunky, and he's also quite a weighty figure as well, which is really nice to see. So I think they've done a really nice job of bringing this version of the character to life. It seems to be very page accurate, which is wonderful. And if we look at the head sculpt, I think they've done a really wonderful job here. There's something unusual about the texture of the plastic that they've used, because it almost looks and feels a little bit rubbery, but not quite, but it gives off this really interesting texture. This is enhanced obviously by a great sculpt. There's lots of detail and lines in the face, lots of furrows in the brow there, but also some fantastic paint washes and paint apps as well. I love the red of the eyes, I love the dark shading around the eyes, but also some of the shading around the cheekbones as well. It just brings this character to life a lot more, which is brilliant. Now there's actually two heads on this figure. I'm going to put them side by side now. Of the two, I prefer the snarling head. Again, a lot more detail here. We can see the teeth, we can see the tongue in the background there, even some of the gums as well. Really nicely painted and really, really well brought to life. So I think they've done a top-notch job here. I'll look at the cape in a little bit more detail in a moment, but you can see the high arching collar and the skull pin, the clasp holding it together. This is very nicely sculpted. There's actually some decent paint apps on this skull as well, and I do like the sculpt of the high-rise collar as well. In terms of the body sculpt, I'm really impressed. I'm not sure if they've just recycled a Hulk body. It's difficult to tell at first glance, and I don't have a Hulk close to hand to really closely examine this, but that's the kind of scale and proportions we are talking about here. This is definitely rivaling any previous Hulk figures we've had, and it may even be a brand new sculpt because it does look a little bit different. However you look at it, this is pretty impressive. This gives the character the requisite size and bulk and power that you would hope this character would have, and I'm tremendously pleased with how they brought this together. Now, sadly, a lot of the detail is just painted in, it isn't actually sculpted in, which is a shame, but he does have some brand new pieces when we look at the gauntlets and around the belt there, and that's well done. And we even see a little bit of paint up, a little bit of shading there on the skull in the centre of that belt. Now, it's a shame that that doesn't extend to the rest of the belt or indeed much else of the figure, but it is there, which is nice, and it does make a difference. On a side note, I do have to point out how pleased I am with the colorization of this figure. I think that pitch between the green and the purple is absolutely perfect. It's almost like a luminous green. It's really bright and colourful, and I love it. Something that is almost certainly new has to be the legs, or at least the bottom part of the legs, because I've never known a Hulk to really wear boots before, at least not in the Marvel Legends line, and of course we have these perfectly in-scale boots, which work really, really nicely for the figure. So these have to be brand new, and I think they've done a decent job. Now, my only criticism here with this figure is, once again, we're seeing a real lack of shading, and that's really most notable when we have a look at the cape, because as you can see here, again, just like with Moondragon, this is a very hard, inflexible, cheap-looking cape, and it's such a shame because actually there's a little bit of texturing on the interior of the cape. It's got kind of a ridge sort of effect to it, but you can't really notice that until you look up close, and that's because there's no shading on it. And if we just had a little bit of shading here and there, a bit of a wash running through it, then this would be much more effective. Looking at the articulation then, he does have a ball joint at the top of the neck, of course, so he can move his head from side to side, although there's a little bit of restriction there from that collar. He can lean it left and right a little bit as well, and of course he can also nod it up and down. Again, you have to work with the collar, but thankfully that collar will move with him. Now, there's ball joints in the shoulders, of course, they lift all the way up and out. There is a complementary bicep swivel there as well, and as you will see, there is a single joint in the arm. This is fairly typical with these big, chunky characters, so it's not so bad. There is a pin joint at the wrist, so that wrist can rotate all the way around, and of course it will also hinge forwards and backwards. You might have to persevere with it when it's brand new, of course, because it's a little bit stiff, but it does have some decent articulation here. Now, there's a straight swivel at the waist, so he will move from side to side. Sadly, there is no ball joint in the chest, which would have been great here, but he does have this joint in the middle of the torso, which will allow him to bend forwards and backwards as well, although, again, it's a bit more restricted when he bends him forwards. He tends to have a little bit more room going backwards. There's ball joints in the hips, so the legs will kick out to the side. There's the complementary thigh swivel at the top there, which is great. But you'll also notice there's actually what appears to be a bit of a boot cut at the top of the boot. Now, I'm not sure if this is intentional. It will move a little bit, but not hugely smoothly, so I'm not quite sure what's going on here. The legs will kick forward, but kick backwards. There is a double joint at the knee, allowing that lower leg to kick all the way back, and then we do have an ankle pivot as well, allowing the foot to hinge forwards and backwards and arch from side to side. Sadly, Drax is also a little light in the accessories department, but he fares a little bit better than Moondragon. He does at least come with an alternate head, which is really cool. As we've already seen, this snarling head is really nicely rendered, but he also has an additional pair of open gripping hands as well. And I think there's just enough here to actually create a few different diverse and interesting looks for the character. So it just about works. I think they've just got it over the post there. And overall, this is pretty successful. As a quick scale comparison, here is Drax standing next to Moondragon. As you can see, he absolutely towers above her. Moondragon is in the typical sort of 6-inch scale range you would expect for a female character in this line, so this differential here is pretty dramatic. If we put Drax up against one of the male characters, in this case it's the Hero's Return Iron Man, again you can see this is still a huge size differential between these two, and it looks absolutely awesome. I think this works really, really well. Thinking of a slightly larger character, here he is standing next to the Thing. Again, as you can see, he's got some significant height on the Thing, making this a pretty imposing match. If you want to pit these two characters against each other, definitely Drax has the advantage here, which is great to see. So for me then, this is an easy 4-star figure. I think they've done a really good job with this figure. Now I think they've recycled a lot of the parts, but there's enough new here to make it feel fresh and interesting, and I had to think twice where I'd seen this before, and then I realised it was on that Venom Amazon exclusive set where we had that oversized character. I think his name was Rage. I'm sorry, it's been a while. But that's where we've seen this body mold before, but actually this works tremendously well. It's massively oversized, it's quite weighty, which is brilliant. It's definitely on a par with any Hulk figure that we've seen. I love the colorization on this figure, and I think that, you know, what we do have in terms of the shading in the head sculpt, little bits and pieces of the accessories around the skulls on the costume, and some of the new bits and pieces, the gauntlets, the boots, definitely make up for any of the recycled elements that we've seen, and it still feels fresh, new and original, which is absolutely fantastic. In terms of the accessories that we get, there's not a huge amount, but as I said, there's enough here to make this interesting and diverse. I really like that we get 2 heads. This works really, really well, and the variety of hands helps with various different posing positions you might want to put him in as well. The only real negatives or drawbacks to this figure from my point of view, again, is the perennial issue of the lack of shading and paint washes over the rest of the body of the figure, and then the cape. And the cape itself is not badly moulded, but I wish they'd use a different material, perhaps a rubber, something a bit more flexible, maybe even cloth with a wire in the cape so you could pose that. We've seen other toy companies do this kind of thing. As it is, this feels very cheap, especially without the extra paint apps running through it. Overall, I have to say this is a fantastic set. Now, I've definitely been critical of certain elements of these figures, especially when it comes to the paint apps and those capes, but other than that, I have to say this is probably one of the better sets we've had this year. We've had a lot of Marvel Legends figures this year already, and a lot of those have been these special 2-pack sets, but for me, this definitely ranks up there as one of the best of the year. I love that we're getting 2 very different kind of figures, which is great. Characters that, in the case of Moondragon, have never debuted in the line before at all. In the case of Drax, this is a classic look, or one of his more definitive looks, I should say, that has never debuted in the line either, and they've both been given a pretty nice treatment for the most part. Yeah, they're lacking a little bit when it comes to the accessories, but overall, these are very welcome additions to the line, and I think Hasbro have done a really good job with these. This is a solid investment. If you're a fan of these characters, if you like the more cosmic side of the Marvel Universe, then you're definitely going to want to pick these up, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. They're really solid entries in a pretty fantastic collection. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a like, and remember to subscribe as there'll be plenty more videos soon.